You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. The Bible is a wisdom book full of instructions and stories that direct you in the way that you can live the best life possible for yourself and those around you. But sometimes the Bible can be taken out of context and used to cause more harm than good. The passage that we're in this week, Genesis 9, has notoriously been one of the most misunderstood and misused passages in the entire Bible. It has even been used to justify slavery as biblical. This week, we are going to address those issues head-on so we can understand Genesis 9, Uncut and Unfiltered. We left off last week at the end of chapter 8, where the flood has ended, Noah has gotten off the ark with his family, they have sacrificed, and God has promised never to destroy the earth again. This week, we pick up right where we left off there, and we see in verse 1 that God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth." That should sound very familiar to you. That is the exact same language straight out of Genesis chapter 2. I highlighted a lot last week how the second half of Genesis 8 going into Genesis 9 is all about a new creation. The flood account is like a decreation. It is a reversal of Genesis 1 and 2 using a lot of the same language, but having it come crashing back in on itself as the world resets to chaos. And now God is working to recreate, to start the human experiment over again. And so we'll see a lot of the exact same language that was used in the first creation having a mirror here in this second creation. We have to view Genesis 1 through 6 as essentially an encapsulated experiment. That was a version of the world that didn't work out. And so now God is completely restarting over again. This is like a new Genesis 1, hence why we have this exact same language. And we have God's blessing happening again. This is the first blessing since the garden, and so I think they're meant to compare and contrast with each other. It is going to be significant later that God did not just bless Noah here, but he blessed Noah and his sons. So keep that in the back of your head because that is going to show up again toward the end of the episode. There are a couple differences between that blessing in Genesis 1:28 and this one here in 9:1. For one thing, there is an absence of the terms subdue and rule. In Genesis 1:28, God told the humans to subdue and rule the earth. And that's not explicitly here. Now, what exactly the significance of that would be is going to depend on who you listen to. Someone like John Walton in The Lost World of the Flood has suggested that this is an intentional statement of how things aren't quite the same as at the garden. In fact, regarding this, he says, "Now, however, extending order based on sacred space and God's presence is no longer possible." In other words, since there is no New Eden, there is no little pocket of sacred space like Eden was, humanity is not able to extend that out like we were supposed to after Genesis 1 and 2. He continues, "But humans are called to maintain social order, which is still a responsibility." Example, judging capital crimes, as we will get to in verse 6. End of quote. That is a possibility. It's fair. But I honestly see verse 2, which we'll get to in just a second, as representative of what subdue and rule meant. Because the idea of subduing and ruling was that you had this chaotic world out there, and you have to spread order to it. That's the idea of subdue. You have to bring order into the chaos of the world. And then ruling I see as maintaining that order. So subduing is we have to take the chaos of the world and control it. And then ruling is we have to maintain that order that we have now formed. And since there were chaos waters and everything has started over, I think we would still have that instruction or that blessing to subdue and rule. So it doesn't make sense to me to say that it is not implied. I realize it is not clearly stated, but I think it is implied in verse 2. A lot of times when something is left off in the Bible, it is significant, so I don't want to just gloss over this. A lot of times there are passages that are very similar to each other, and then there'll be just like one or two words off. And that's a way that the author is winking at you, suggesting that there is a purpose behind his leaving that out. I'm not 100% sure why that is in this case. I'm open to ideas. If you have any, feel free to reach out and let me know why you think subdue and rule may not have been included in this version of the blessing. But to me, I see them as implied in verse 2, since we're talking about the way that the animals are going to react fearfully against humans. A lot of times when humans try to subdue the chaos and keep it back, they end up mistreating the world. And I don't think that's what God intended at all, but it is often the case. So I think that by God saying the animals will be afraid of us, he is saying that we will continue to subdue and rule, and we will also continue to do it in a fashion that is less than perfect. One other thing that is missing here is the statement of God's resting. You'll remember from Genesis 1 that at the end of the creation week, God rested. There was no end to the seventh day. He just basked in the glory of his new creation. And that is not present here in this one. Part of that could be because there is no new Eden. Perhaps you could see the ark as still being the Eden, but I think Eden was always kind of meant to be a headquarters that we could go back to, and I don't think the ark was intended to be something they could go back to. I think it was more just their launching point moving forward. So there are definitely some differences, and it doesn't always line up perfectly, but it gets us thinking and meditating on what the comparisons may have been between Genesis 1 and Genesis 9. I want to mention something here that I kind of doubt many of you have ever heard of before, and it's called the 7 Laws of Noah. This is prominent in many forms of the Jewish belief system, and they would say that God established here 7 laws with Noah, go figure, 7, right, that were intended for all of humanity. We have the 613-ish laws of the Torah that are given to Moses for Israel specifically, but that was only for Israel. So these 7 laws of Noah are intended for everybody to follow. And so from a Jewish perspective, this would be how someone who isn't a Jew could be righteous in God's sight. This is how maybe someone who had never heard of Judaism could still be pleasing to God, is if they follow these 7 laws. Now, amusingly, only 3 of the 7 actually appear here in this text. Most of them come from Talmudic tradition, and 5 of them match the 10 Commandments. Now, sometimes, depending on which resource you're looking at, the 7 laws can be slightly different. But in general, they boil down to number 1, don't worship idols. Number 2, don't curse God. Number 3, do not murder. Number 4, don't commit adultery. Number 5, don't steal. Number 6, do not eat flesh torn from a living animal. And number 7, establish courts of justice. Now, if you're familiar with the 10 Commandments, again, several of those should sound familiar. Don't worship idols. Don't curse God. Don't murder. Don't commit adultery. But the last 2 are not in the 10 Commandments, and that is not to eat flesh from a living animal and to establish courts of justice. And amusingly, those are actually 2 of the 3 that are from this passage directly. The other one is not to murder. In over 20 years of going to church and several years of being in Bible colleges, I had never once heard about these 7 laws of Noah. They are pretty much completely absent from Christian thought, but they are very prominent in Jewish thought, so I wanted to bring a little bit of attention to them here as we go. Moving into verse 2, let's look at the rest of this new blessing that God is giving. He says, "The fear of you and the dread of you will be on every beast of the earth, every fowl of the air, on everything that moves on the earth, upon all the fish in the sea. To your hand they are delivered." Going off on a brief rabbit trail here, I mentioned a couple of weeks ago how when a preacher says all always means all, it's not actually accurate because there are several times the Bible engages in hyperbole. This is a great example of that. Does every single animal that has ever existed fear humans? No, absolutely not. So does that mean the Bible is wrong here? No, that's not what it's trying to say. It's speaking in this broad brushing terminology because that's just very common for this type of literature. If we're being honest, it's very common in our daily dialogue too. We speak in hyperbole and exaggerated dialogue to get our point across. So this is not some sort of truth claim where we look at this and say, oh, the Bible got this wrong. No, we just have to acknowledge that sometimes we have to put those pithy sayings aside and just use our brains when we're studying the Bible and realize that it's okay for it to use poetic language, even if that makes us uncomfortable. It's our framework that has to change. And I do want to point out that this is not a very positive verse here. This is kind of a negative thing. This is not God's saying that all animals should be afraid of humans, like that is what's supposed to happen. I could imagine someone taking this out of context and saying, see, animals are supposed to be scared of us, so I can go hunt whatever I want, cut down on animal populations in an area, or abuse animals or whatever, because they're supposed to be afraid of us. No, this could actually better be translated. The fear of you and the dread of you will come upon every beast of the earth. So God is not saying it should happen this way as a prescription. He's saying it will happen this way as a description. He is saying this is something that humanity is going to bring about. God is not the one ordaining this. It doesn't say, I have made all of the animals fear you. He says the animals will fear you. And I think it's implied that we're the reason for that because of how we've treated them. It's also worth observing that diet back then was very different than diet today. In America today, the majority of us can go to a supermarket that is probably within 15 minutes, maybe a half hour max, and we can get any form of meat that we want. You can get steak, hamburger, you can get poultry, chicken, turkey, fish, shrimp, you name it, you can get just about anything. That is not the way that humans have eaten for the majority of human history. Meat was kind of a rarity. It wasn't just something where it was in constant supply. Because if you're eating meat, that means that you killed the animal. And since animals weren't in constant supply, you often needed them for other things. So you're not just going to go willy-nilly killing all these different animals. They didn't have these massive slaughterhouses like we have today to keep all these different animals. They didn't just raise animals to kill and eat. At least not the average person, maybe a very, very rich person. But for the average person, meat would have been something special, maybe for a special occasion. The IVP Bible Background Commentary has noted this as well. They said meat was not a common dish on ancient dinner tables. Animals were kept for their milk, hair, and wool, not specifically their meat. Thus, meat was only available when an animal died or was killed as a sacrifice. Now, moving with that thought into verse 4, we have to get into a rather interesting discussion here. Because verse 4 says, "But the flesh with the life thereof, wherein is the blood, you shall not eat." And you know what, let's read the next couple verses as well, because they all fit together. We don't want to just read a verse in isolation. We want to get the whole context so we see how this all goes together. So, "The flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, you will not eat. Surely your blood of your life will I require. At the hand of every beast I will require it. At the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of a human. Whoever sheds a human's blood, by a human will his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he humans." This feels like a bit of an odd aside when we're talking about God's blessing humanity and saying animals are going to be afraid of you, and then you can eat animals. And, oh yeah, by the way, don't eat blood. That sounds really strange until you realize that the reason for the flood was untamed violence, excessive bloodshed. A lot of times we think of the flood coming just because of some generic human wickedness, and we fill that in with whatever we want to. Maybe it's lying or disrespecting parents or sexuality or whatever somebody's pet peeve is. But the picture that the Bible portrays is that the main reason for the flood was excessive human violence. In an ancient Near Eastern context, there were two ways that you could shed blood: in an orderly manner or in a chaotic manner, in an appropriate manner or in an inappropriate manner. Blood shed as part of a sacrifice was considered appropriate, orderly. You might even say in the course of war, that would be appropriate. But bloodshed in the form of murder, that is not appropriate. That brings chaos into the land. That spills blood into the earth. And that is why God had to flood the land. And we talked about how there was all these different kinds of cleansing words that were used, words that actually meant something like washing clean or wiping a slate clean. I think the idea was that too much human blood had chaotically seeped into the land so that God actually needed to wash the land clean, quite literally with water, in order to start over again. So the main reason for the flood was this untamed violence, all of this bloodshed. So now God is making very specific instructions about blood and what to do with it in order to keep humans restrained on how they shed blood. And again, this is really strange to us modern Americans, because the average American doesn't really deal with blood unless they get some sort of a cut, and it's their blood that comes out. Now, maybe if you work as a first responder, like an EMT or something, you're going to deal with it a little bit more frequently. But the average person doesn't really think about blood, deal with blood, unless they get cut. In an ancient context, that is not at all the case. Blood was super important in the ancient Near East, and it represented the life force. Because, well, if you think about it, if too much blood is drained out of your body, you're no longer alive, so it makes sense. You need this blood to survive. So blood itself becomes representative of life. And by saying that you have to shed blood in an orderly fashion, the Bible is saying here that the life of these creatures is not yours. You did not create them. Don't take life. You're not the creator. And when you get messy with just killing for fun or sport, you can end up with a low regard for life. So these instructions on blood, and notice it's not just human blood that's being talked about here, but animal blood as well, because we're supposed to be good stewards of the animals also. So these instructions on blood are intended to prevent the same issues that led to the flood in the first place. IVP, Bible Background Commentary, again has noted, the prohibition does not require that no blood at all be consumed, but only that the blood must be drained. The draining of the blood before eating the meat was a way of returning the life force of the animal to the God who gave it. This offers recognition that they have taken the life with permission and are partaking of God's bounty as his guests. Its function is not unlike that of a blessing said before a meal in modern practice. No comparable prohibition, though, is known in the ancient world." End quote. Equating blood with life, the Net Bible observes, "You must not eat meat with its life in it. Because of the carnage produced by the flood, people might conclude that life is cheap and therefore treat it lightly. But God will not permit them to kill or even to eat anything with the lifeblood still in it, serving as a reminder of the sanctity of life." End quote. Now, we have to step back for a second and put on our ancient Near Eastern thinking caps, because I have to take you completely out of modern 21st century America and into an ancient mindset. So take a deep breath and imagine we are now in the ancient Near East. Before I go any further, I have to warn you, what I'm about to say for about the next minute or so here is decently graphic, so if you're squeamish listening to this, you might want to skip ahead a couple minutes. Okay. Something like verse 4 actually had significance in the ancient world. Today we read, "Don't eat the flesh with the life in it, with the blood in it," and we just think, what does that even mean, and how could I possibly apply that? Well, in an ancient world, people actually would sometimes tear meat off of living animals, maybe pull off a limb or something along those lines, because they weren't killing the animal. They wanted to keep it for other things, but they wanted just some of the meat. Or maybe they were just being cruel and violent. That sounds super foreign and strange and gross and disgusting to us today. And that's a good thing. I think that's actually a result of this being in the Bible and the Bible's ethics being carried around the world, is the majority of people have never even considered eating a living animal. However, I do have to say, there are parts of the world today where this is still a practice. Now, it is not super common, but there are areas around the world where you can eat living animals. A lot of times this is going to be some sort of like sushi. I don't mean raw, I mean living. If you want to see that I'm not crazy and you have the stomach for it, you can type in online, people eating live animals. You can find plenty of videos on YouTube. I actually saw a couple of them when I was prepping this, and it's honestly really disturbing. And I realize different cultures have different standards, but I think that the Bible's ethic here is addressing that sort of thing, saying don't eat a living animal because that is cruel. That is cruel to the animal. Just because they're not human doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want to them. Now, I've known some people who have looked at a verse like this and have thought, oh, that means that if I'm eating meat like a steak or a hamburger, I can't eat it rare. I have to make sure it's well done. There's absolutely no pink in it. But that is not accurate. That just shows our modern ignorance of how animals are slaughtered for food. When you get a piece of meat in a restaurant today or at a grocery store, there is no blood left in it. When an animal is slaughtered for consumption, the blood is drained out from that animal. What you see when you order a rare steak is not blood. It's called myoglobin, and it's a protein. And when it mixes with water, it ends up looking like blood. It gets that red color to it. But it is in no wise blood. So if you have ever heard someone use a verse like this in the Bible to say that you should not eat rare meat, don't even give it a second thought. That is not even a Bible problem. That is just a misunderstanding of how modern food is prepared. So it's not talking about that. What this is talking about is not eating meat that has been taken from a live animal. That is what animals in the wild do. Animals in the wild do not cook their food. They just eat it raw right off of the carcass. And so this instruction is intended to separate humans from animal-like practices. This is saying don't be an animal in how you eat. Have some manners, have some thought for not just humans, but also for the animals. I want to take a second and address something here, because to the majority of you listening, the command to not eat a living animal probably just sounds like a no-brainer. You're going to say, what in the world? Like, who would actually do that? And like I mentioned, there are some people who actually still do today. But the very fact that you are here saying that doesn't make sense, why would anybody ever do that, is a testament to how much the Bible has influenced culture. See, a lot of times people seem to think that the laws in the Bible have to be uncomfortable for us to follow. They're like not common sense. They go against what we like. Man, I would love to not have to tell the truth all the time, but the Bible says that I'm not supposed to lie. Man, I'd love to just have sex with whoever I want to, but the Bible says you can't commit adultery. And it's as if the Bible's commands always have to be the opposite of what you want. I think there's a psychological reason for that, where a lot of churches have created this performance-based Christianity that keeps you coming back because you feel like you will never measure up enough for God. And they just keep raising the bar higher and higher. So the more spiritual, quote unquote, that you get, the more they just raise the bar. It becomes unattainable. You're never actually going to reach the point where you are good in God's sight. God is comfortable with you. The average person isn't reading their Bible every day. So the preacher is going to push for them to read their Bible every day. And let's say you get someone who does. Well, then the next question becomes, well, how long are you reading your Bible today? 15 minutes? Well, I read it for an hour a day. So you took that next step, but now you have to take another. You thought you had gotten to a point where you could check it off and say, okay, I've actually reached a point of spiritual maturity or whatever you want to call it. But now you realize that you are just as far, actually you're even further away than where you were before from God's ideal. That's what so many of these churches do, and that way it keeps you needy. It's honestly like an abusive relationship. If there was a husband or a boyfriend that was doing this to his significant other, I would tell that other person, that's not a healthy relationship. You might want to consider getting out of that. If he just keeps you coming back to him for your needs, he never actually says that you've done a good job. He just adds on to it and says, oh, well, that's not actually good enough. You have to do more now. That's not healthy. And that's the relationship a lot of people are in with their churches. But I don't think that's the point of the Bible. The Bible's commands do not have to be difficult. The Bible's commands do not have to be hard to follow. They don't have to be counterintuitive. In fact, Deuteronomy 30 says the exact opposite. And mind you, this is after all 600 plus laws have been given. So even the super obscure stuff that we don't like to talk about, hidden away in Leviticus and the end of Exodus and Deuteronomy, after all of that, God says in Deuteronomy 30 verse 11, the commands that I have given you today are not too hard for you. They are not beyond what you can do. It's not way up in the heavens. You don't have to say, who's going up to heaven and get it for us so we can obey and keep it. It's not on the other side of the sea. This is possible for the average person to follow. These are common sense instructions for us to follow. So a lot of times when I start to teach on some of these Old Testament laws and show people what they actually mean and how attainable they are, people almost feel like it's too easy. Like I'm saying they are already following God's law and they don't have to keep striving and pushing in order to make God happy. And as soon as you realize that, I go, yes, you got it. Absolutely. That is the point. Especially people who have been going to church for a long time and trying their best to follow the Bible. They are already doing the stuff that God wants them to do. Now, because of what they have heard in churches, they feel like they're not doing enough for God, but they are already checking these boxes. They are doing this right stuff. So a lot of the time when we're able to take these commands, boil them down, get rid of all of the Christianese and baggage that they have gained over the years and just get back down to what they meant to the original audience, we see that they're just common sense things. Like this, the average person today is going to say, of course I would never just rip a leg off of an animal and start eating it. That's gross, that's disgusting, that's cruel. Why is that so common sense? Because the Bible set that standard so long ago and people have started following it. And that is totally okay. That is a good thing when you realize, wow, I don't actually have to worry about following this instruction. I already am following it. It takes a lot of stress off of the relationship with God. And so I know that's a little bit of a rabbit trail here. And I'm sure I will get more into that in future episodes of the podcast. I'm sure we'll do something more in the Torah later on, and some of these obscure laws that people freak over. Really, they're not as hard as we make them out to be. They're pretty common sense. So if you have in your version of Christianity a lot of stress around following the laws of the Bible and which laws do I have to keep, which ones do I not have to, that's not what God has intended for you. That is not a loving relationship. That is an anxiety-inducing relationship. This is a whole other issue for another day, but I really am not surprised with how much anxiety is rampant in churches, how many people deal with undiagnosed anxiety disorders, how many panic attacks happen in churches where people feel like they have to leave and they don't know why a lot of times. Well, it's because this is a high-stress, high-control version of the religion that is not at all what God originally wanted. It is humans taking the good news of the Bible and perverting it. And that's kind of the theme that we have here today. Because as we get to the end, we're going to see that happen even more. So I hope through this podcast, we're able to untwist these scriptures, get back to the basics of the Bible, and just teach it for what it was. If you are going to church, if you are listening to people, preachers, podcasts, sermons, reading books, whatever it may be, and you are walking away feeling more anxious, stressed, worried about what God thinks of you than before you walked in, I would recommend you start considering finding new preachers to listen to, a new church to go to, new podcasts, new books to read, because that is not God's intent for you. He does not want to bring more fear, anxiety, and worry, but he wants to bring more love, more self-control, and more balanced thinking. And before you accuse me of being too hippie in my theology there, that was taken right out of 2 Timothy 1:7. So just keep that in mind. Verse 9, God says, "Surely your blood of your life I will require. At the hand of every beast I will require it. At the hand of every man. At the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of a human. Whoever sheds a human's blood, by a human shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he humans." And Net Bible observes, the point is that God will require the blood of someone who kills, since the person killed is a relative, a brother of the killer. The language reflects Noah's situation. After the flood, everyone was a part of Noah's extended family, but also supports the concept of the brotherhood of humanity. According to Genesis account, the entire human race descended from Noah. End of quote. I will point out that in verse 6, where it says, "Whosoever sheds a human's blood, by a human will his blood be shed," instead of by a human, it could possibly be on account of the human. Robert Alter has commented on this. He says, "In either case, a system of retributive justice is suggested. As many analysts of the Hebrew have noted, there is an emphatic play on the word dam, and that's the word blood in Hebrew, and Adam, human. You can see the similarity there between dam, blood, Adam, human." Alter continues, "And the chiastic word order of the Hebrew formally mirrors the idea of measure for measure. Shofek, dam ha'adam, ba'adam, damo yishafek. The human who spills blood of the human, by the human, his blood will be spilled." So you have this chiasm here where it's line A, then line B, then line C. C lines up with C prime, B prime lines up with B, A prime lines up with A. That's really hard to explain in the podcast. I will put the idea in the show notes, but it is very common. I've talked about this a little bit, I think in a couple of our first episodes. Very, very common Hebrew literary structure that's formed where a part of the story, or sometimes even just a part of the verse, each section lines up parallel with one that comes later. Alter finishes out, "Perhaps the ban on bloodshed at this point suggests that murder was the endemic violence of the antediluvians." End quote. I agree. That is what we've already touched on so far today. I do think it's interesting that God entrusted humanity with the responsibility of a judicial system rather than taking it on himself, seeing as he would have been impartial. Like, you could just say, "Hey, God, what do we do with this person? Did he murder this person? Should he be killed for it?" Like, God would be the one to make that decision. And humans could very easily muck up the process. But God, for whatever reason, gave that authority to his representatives on his behalf. That being said, I want to remind you of what happened in Genesis 4. When the very first human born outside of the garden becomes a murderer, God did not kill the murderer. So I do not think this is his ideal. I don't think this is giving a full blessing for the death penalty. And I'll try not to be too political here because that's not the point of the podcast. I try to avoid those discussions as much as I can. And that's just not the main thing I want to get into here either. But the death penalty becomes a big political issue. And Christians land on both sides of this. And I have been in both camps where I have seen people fully requiring a death penalty for everything from murder to sometimes far less than that. And then I've also known plenty of good Christians who would say the opposite, that the death penalty is inconsistent with Christian theology. And I have to say, there is a tension in these biblical texts where we have to look at these side by side and say, yes, here, God gave authority to humans to make sure that blood is not shed meaninglessly. But we also have to look at that in connection to all of the other passages in the Bible that talk about giving people a second chance, turning the other cheek. And I am not saying that we should let murderers off scot-free. I'm not saying that we should let criminals roam our streets. What I am saying is that this is not a clear black and white issue. If you are just looking for a verse to defend your position, you can take this verse out and say that the death penalty is extremely appropriate. Or you could take out any number of other verses and say that maybe it's not the best option. So we have to realize that this is a topic for debate, one where good Christians can disagree on it, and one where maybe not every single situation is going to be the same. This might be something that has to be decided on a case-by-case basis. Before we move on to the next verse, we have to note how verse 6 ended. This is all because in the image of God made he humans. Now, even though this is past tense, it still apparently has bearing in the present. Whatever it means to be or to have the image of God did not stop at the fall. It did not stop at the flood. It has carried on past the flood, and I would say even to this day. And if you want more on that, you can go back to our third episode where I discuss what it means to be the image of God in an ancient context. Verse 7 continues the restated blessing to swarm around the earth. Be fruitful, multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth, multiply therein. And just like in chapter 1, this is not a command for everybody to have as many children as possible. This is a blessing, saying that you have God's blessing to do this if that is what you choose. I get into that more in our early episodes as well. Moving into verse 8, God said to Noah and to his sons with him, behold, I establish my covenant with you, with your descendants after you, and get this, verse 10, with every living creature that is with you, of the fowl, of the cattle, of every beast of the earth with you, from all that go out of the ark to every beast of the earth. This is the first explicitly mentioned covenant in the Bible. Now, this is yet another conversation for another day that I am sure we will get into at some point. But there are some theologians who view the Bible through a main lens of the covenants that are within it. And you end up with everything from the covenant of Noah, covenant with Abraham, covenant with David. You end up with a new covenant in the New Testament, which is actually kind of redundant because the word testament is actually the word covenant. So when you're reading your New Testament, that is the new covenant. I kind of wish it had been translated that way because who in the world knows what a testament is anymore? Covenant makes more sense. It's at least closer to something that we can understand today, I think. But it was not, and I was not consulted on that, unfortunately. Not sure why. Maybe it got lost in the mail. Regardless, this is the first explicitly mentioned covenant in the Bible. Some people will try to say that there are more covenants that are implicit. They are implied in the text. Some suggest there was a covenant before creation. Some say there was a covenant with Adam. Those are not specifically mentioned in the text. And again, that is a whole debate that I am not looking to step into today. But I guess it's kind of an if you know, you know. If you were raised maybe in I'd say maybe a Southern Baptist tradition kind of focuses on this. Sometimes a lot of the Reformed, maybe even Lutheran, Anglican, probably Presbyterian churches would fall under these categories. So if you are from a different circle than that, you may not be as familiar with these debates. And again, they are not central to what we're talking about today. So mostly glazing over that. But I do want you to be aware that they are there. And so some people would say that this is not actually the first covenant in the Bible, even though it is the first one that is explicitly mentioned. I think I may have touched on that slightly when we talked about God's initial blessing to Adam and how it does have all of the trappings of a covenant. Honestly, I'm okay with wherever you land on this. If you want to say God made a covenant with Adam, okay. It doesn't explicitly say that. I think it can be inferred from that. It really does not make a huge difference whether you see that or not. Just realize that this is the first time it is explicitly called a covenant in Scripture. I think one of the important things that we need to notice and not gloss over in our debate there is that this covenant is not just with Noah. It's not just with humans. It's actually with the animals as well. I grew up in a tradition where animals were very clearly secondary to humans. Any kind of organization like PETA, or honestly even just the average vegan or vegetarian person, would be looked at pretty funny as some hippie tree hugger that just doesn't like steak. But it's interesting to me as I read the Bible to see how much God truly cares, not just for humans, but for all of his creation, for the land and for the animals. And do with that whatever you want. I am not trying to make a value statement over whether you should or shouldn't eat meat or anything like that. And I do think that we are pretty clearly placed above the animals in Scripture. But I also think that we go too far a lot of times in how we treat animals, and we don't consider that they are part of God's beloved creation as well. I'm not equating them with humans, but I am saying that they should have at least some basic dignity in the way that we treat them. Let's get into a little bit of a debate here in verse 11, because God says, I will establish my covenant with you, neither will all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither will there be any more a flood to destroy the earth. For context, let me go back a little bit to Genesis 8:21, where we ended last week. Noah has gotten off the ark, he makes the sacrifice, God smells it, and he says in his heart, I will not again curse the ground anymore for human's sake, because the imagination of humanity's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done. Now catch that. Neither will I smite, and that means to strike dead, any more every living thing as I have done. So God is saying, I will never again destroy all life. In this verse, in Genesis 9, verse 11, God says, neither will all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither will there be any more a flood to destroy the earth. Here is why this is important, and I am drawing attention to this. Christians are often known for having this idea that God is going to destroy the entire world again. He's just going to burn the whole place up in fire. And that belief comes almost entirely out of 2 Peter 3. And there are some other passages that sometimes get added into this mix, but the main thing comes out of 2 Peter 3. Now, I do not have the time to get into this whole thing today. This has to be another discussion, and I want to possibly make a whole episode dealing with Peter and his connection to the flood story and how he uses it in his letters. But the reason this whole thing matters for our discussion today is because the Christians who look at this and say God is going to destroy the world again say, well, he can't destroy it by water, because here in Genesis 9, verse 11, he says, I will never again cut off all life by the waters of a flood, neither will there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. So he can't do it by water, so instead of water, he's going to do it by fire. Now, that 2 Peter 3 passage is very complex. The language behind it is very difficult to translate, and there's a lot of ambiguity there. In fact, it is possible, and I would say even acceptable, to look at that passage and walk away with the belief that God is not going to burn up the entire world at the end of time again. Now, if that sounds heretical and totally different to you than anything you have ever heard, I'm sorry, I just have to leave it as a teaser right now. I can't get into that whole discussion, but I promise you we will get there eventually at some point, because it really is important and it makes a major difference in how you live today, whether you think that the world is going to just one day be burnt up or whether you think it will continue. Because if it's just going to get all burnt up, well, we don't really have to worry too much about conserving anything. We don't really have to worry about climate change or global warming, because all that's not real. God's just going to destroy the whole thing and start over again. But there are many Christians who look at that passage and walk away with a very different belief that the earth is not going to be destroyed by fire, and that we have to be very careful in how we manage the resources on this planet. Again, just teaser for another time. So let that roll around, come up with some questions for it, send them in. We will definitely get to that. I think for where we are right now, it's important to realize that just because Genesis 9:11 specifies that God will not destroy with a flood, does not negate Genesis 8:21, where he says he will never wipe out all flesh again. So I think we have to take these two in tandem and say, what's the least common denominator between not destroying the earth and not destroying the earth with a flood? Well, it's not destroying the earth. So I think that's what we have to go with, that our verse here in chapter 9 is just adding to that to show, not only am I never going to destroy the earth again, let me reiterate it to you, I am not going to destroy the earth like this ever again. So you can't just pull out verse 9, say, oh, God's not going to flood the earth so he can burn it up instead. You also have to remember chapter 8, verse 21. We can't pick and choose which verses we want to defend our views like that, especially not when they're that close side by side. I'll also point out here that some people will use this verse, chapter 9, verse 11, to argue against a localized flood. They would say that since we have had localized floods since then, this has to be a universal flood, because God says there won't be another flood like that again. So since there are regional floods, and God said there won't be a flood like it again, this must not have been regional. And I get where they're coming from. However, I don't think that is a good argument against the position. And here's why. Because if we actually look closely at the verse, God does not say there will never be floods again. He says that he will not cause a flood again for the purpose of destroying the land and cutting off flesh. Neither will all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither shall there be any more a flood to destroy the earth, for the purpose of destroying the earth, or destroying the land in a regional sense. That does not mean that there won't ever be other floods again. It just means that when they come, they are not going to be specifically sent by God as a form of judgment. This goes back to our conversation, we've had it a couple of times now, because I like to harp on this a little bit because I've known Christians who will look at current events and claim that any national tragedy or natural disaster is a result of God's wrath against someone. We have had preachers here in America claim that hurricanes were a result of immorality, but that is not how these things work in the Bible. The message of the Bible overall is that sometimes bad things just happen because we live in a post-Eden world. We live in a sin-sick world. We live in a world where people hurt other people. Not every bad thing that happens is a result of God's judgment. In fact, most of the time the Bible says that it is not God's judgment against people and that he loves those people. It is very harmful theology to assume that just because some natural disaster occurred, something that we would call, quote unquote, an act of God on an insurance document, that it actually is an act of God in judgment. Just because it's not something that we caused doesn't mean that it's something that automatically God caused. The point of this verse is not for God to say there will never be another flood again, regional or global. He does not say there won't be other floods. He doesn't even say that we can't create more floods of our own through our own mishandling of nature. He's saying that he will no longer use that method for the purpose of wiping out humanity. So we have to be very careful that we don't create harmful theologies out of mishandlings of the text. Let's be precise and accurate in how we apply the biblical texts so that we don't cause more harm than good. Robert Alter pulls something really interesting out of verse 12 that I had never heard before, and this is fascinating to me. So let me read you the quote from his translation commentary of the Torah. This is the first instance of a common convention of the biblical narrative. When a speaker addresses someone and the formula for introducing speech is repeated with no intervening response from the interlocutor, it generally indicates some sort of significant silence, a failure to comprehend, a resistance to the speaker's words, and so forth. Compare Judges 8:23-24. First, Gideon declares to his men that he will not rule over them. Seeing their evident resistance, he proposes a concrete alternative that they can understand, the collection of gold ornaments to make an ephod. Here, God first flatly states his promise never to destroy the world again. The flood-battered Noah evidently needs further assurance, so God goes on with a second formula for introducing speech, to offer the rainbow as outward token of his covenant. The third occurrence of this formula, at the beginning of verse 17, introduces a confirming summary of the rainbow as a sign of the covenant, end quote. So here's what he means, because I realize he used some technical language there. God starts speaking here in verse 8. He says, I'll establish my covenant with you, with all of the animals. I'm not going to destroy the land again. Then verse 12 says, And God said, this is the token. So there is nothing in between verse 11 and verse 12. God is still the one speaking. So it would be completely natural to leave out that and God said. If I was telling you what a friend of mine said, and I said, my friend said that he went to the store today, and then he went to the gym, and then he went back home and cooked dinner. Okay, that's normal. What would be a little weird is if I said, my friend said he went to the store today, and then my friend said that he went to the gym, and my friend said that he cooked dinner when he went back home. I don't need to say every single time my friend said this. If I do say it that way, you would kind of assume there was something in between that. Maybe there was dialogue. You said something, so I need to start over and remind you that I'm talking about what my friend said. Maybe that's not the best illustration, but it's the easiest thing I can come up with here without having like a visual that you'd be able to see. The fact that the text says a second time, and God said, when God is the only one speaking, seems to suggest that a response from Noah was anticipated, but not received. God declares this covenant with him, and then there's just silence from Noah. So God speaks again. And then it actually happens a third time in verse 17, where there has still been no response from Noah. And so the verse begins again, and God said to Noah. So Alter is suggesting that Noah is just completely shell-shocked from surviving this flood, that when God speaks to him, he doesn't have the mental faculty to respond. He is just completely shot emotionally from this whole ordeal. And even though that's not the way that we normally picture Noah, I kind of believe it. We're going to get to this in just a second, but the next thing that we see Noah doing is he goes out and he builds a vineyard. I'm assuming that he had to start from the ground up because of the flood. I realized that there were still some existent olive trees, apparently, because, the dove found the olive branch. So maybe there were still some grapes in the region that were able to be used, but I kind of doubt it. I'm not honestly even sure how the olive tree would have had any life with the amount of pressure that all of that rain would have had on the area, unless maybe it was a regional flood and Noah ended up in the mountains of Ararat where part of that region wasn't affected or something. I mean, that gets into all kinds of conjecture. But all of that to say, let's assume that Noah had to start from the beginning and he's planting the grapes. It's going to take roughly 3 years for grapes to grow to a point where they're actually an edible crop. And then it's usually going to take a couple more years before they're any good for making wine. And that is apparently what Noah is trying to do, because as we'll find out here in a few minutes, he gets drunk in his vineyard. Now, there's definitely some time distortion going on here because we're talking 3 to 5, possibly more years for all of this to happen, and it's all, side by side in the verses here. But I think the implication of the text is that Noah was very purposefully making this vineyard for the purpose of making wine, for the purpose of getting drunk. And before you judge him too harshly for that, think about what you would do if you survived a mass slaughter of all of the humans in your region. And not just the humans, but the animals. If you heard the cries of the people on the outside of the ark when the rain started coming down and they were trying to get on, that would mess with a person's psyche big time. I tried to represent that a little bit when we did our Sacred Nightmares second episode. And I presented Noah as basically going mad from that. And I took some inspiration from Darren Aronofsky's 2014 Noah film, which if you have not seen, I would actually recommend you see that. I realize it got a bad rap from a lot of critics and from a lot of Christians because they were expecting a Bible version of the story of Noah. But that's not what Aronofsky was going for. He was creating his story based on the Jewish traditions about Noah, which are very different from what's in the biblical text. So what happens in the Noah movie from 2014, I tend to think could actually be closer to reality than what a lot of people think of with Noah. I'm not saying the whole thing is exactly how it happened. There's definitely some fantasy in there, but it gets you thinking about the story in a way that you never had before. And in that story, Noah absolutely becomes insane from having to kill people to prevent them from getting onto the ark. And he thinks that God wants him and his family to be the last humans ever alive. So he actually tries to kill his grandchildren when his daughter-in-law is going to be pregnant. It gets really, really interesting. I'll try not to spoil too much there, but it's a very interesting movie that I would definitely recommend watching to get a little bit of a different perspective on this story. But it makes sense to me very much that if you were that person, if you survived this kind of horrible event, you would be doing anything you could to self-medicate and get that out of your head, because that's just awful to have to live through. So all of that to say, I think that altar is onto something here, that the 3 times God is said to be speaking are because Noah is silent when we're expecting a response from him, because he is just totally shell-shocked from the flood. Let's talk about the rainbow here, because in verse 12, God says, this is the token, and that word token is the same word as the sign that was given to Cain. So when we're thinking about this rainbow, we should be thinking of its meaning as something similar to the mark that was given to Cain, whatever that may have been. So God says, this is the token, the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you to every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. In other words, it's just going to keep on going. So Noah seems to be completely flabbergasted at everything. He doesn't have words for this. He's maybe even unsure that God is actually going to honor this and not wipe them out. So God says, here, I'm going to give you a sign of this. I'm going to give you something that as long as you have this, it's a sign that you still have my favor. You are not going to be wiped out. And he says, I do set my bow in the cloud. Now notice, it doesn't say rainbow. It says, I will set my bow in the cloud, and it will be a token for my covenant between me and the earth. And it will come to pass when I bring a cloud over the earth that the bow will be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters will no more become a flood to destroy all the earth. The bow will be in the cloud. I will look on it. I will remember the everlasting, the forever covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. Now, I drew attention to the fact that it doesn't say rainbow. It says bow. Here's why that's important. Because this is the standard word for a war bow, the kind of bow that you would stick arrows in and shoot in combat. So the rainbow is actually a war bow. And that is significant because the picture here is of God's hanging up his war bow so that he will not again use it against humanity. Think about a rainbow. Which way is it pointing? Up, not down. God's bow is now pointed back up at himself, not down at humanity. So whenever you see a rainbow, it is a reminder to you of God's love. I think that's important to focus on for a second, because in the world that we live in today, the rainbow has become a symbol of conflict. And I really think that misses the point. In 1978, a man by the name of Gilbert Baker used the rainbow colors to create a flag to represent the LGBTQIA community. And many Christians didn't like that. They saw that as an attack on their beliefs because of the rainbow significance in the Bible. And so there has been this whole fight over the rainbow. And I remember especially when the Ark Encounter was being built in Kentucky, whatever that was, probably about 10 years ago or so. And a big thing that Answers in Genesis would say is take back the rainbow. The idea being that the gays stole the rainbow from us Christians and we just need to take it back. But they didn't actually say what taking it back would look like, aside from donating, because that was always in the packet with a little mailer that you were supposed to send back with money in it. So I guess taking back the rainbow means that I send money to Ken Ham, and what he does with that, he builds an ark, so somehow now the rainbow's Christian again. I never quite figured out how that worked. I'm not trying to make too much fun of it here, but it is kind of ridiculous that we have taken something that stands for the love of God and we have turned it into a war. Somebody else taking the rainbow as a symbol for something does not negate the rainbow's significance within the Bible. Symbols take on different meanings in different cultures. I could maybe understand if Gilbert Baker had taken a cross or some, distinctly Christian symbol like that and used it for gay pride. But he didn't. He took a rainbow and it had nothing to do with stealing that from Christians or the Bible. He has said that he chose that because of the diversity of color. He was just trying to represent diversity with it. He wasn't trying to take anything from the Bible with it. And Christians didn't seem to care that much about the rainbow before this. It would get talked about when this passage would be brought up, but it's not like it was a major Christian symbol. If you see a cross, you get the idea that it's a Christian symbol. If you saw maybe a depiction of the empty tomb, you would think Christian symbol. But if you saw a rainbow, you wouldn't have thought of it being identified with any one particular group up until all of this happened. Conservative Christianity was not consistently using the rainbow as a symbol until they felt like that was taken from them and by people that they disagreed with. And so they wanted to make some point against that. Now realize, I am not trying to make some discussion or debate today out of human sexuality. This is not a discussion on that. I am just purely talking about the rainbow and the significance behind it. When you look up in the sky and you see a rainbow, according to this text, it is a sign that God is not ticked off at humanity. It is supposed to be a sign that God is not at war with humanity. Implied, God loves you. And we have taken that and turned it into a battleground. And maybe, just maybe, if somebody wants to use those same colors to represent something significant for their community, maybe we shouldn't be so stressed out about that. And maybe we should just focus more on living out what that symbol is supposed to be for our community. Let's not take something that is a symbol of love and anti-aggression and turn it into an aggressive symbol of war either way. If somebody else wants to use that for something else, even if you don't agree with that, let them. You do not have a monopoly on colors. Just let it have the significance to you that it is intended to. God is not ticked off at you. He loves you. And you know what the amazing thing is? I just spent 5 minutes talking about why we shouldn't stress over something that's supposed to be about God's love. And I am sure that some Christians are going to listen to this and get ticked off and assume things from what I said that I didn't say. And they're going to turn this whole thing into a verbally violent debate again, even though what I just said is that the point is to keep it loving. So please do us all a favor, and no matter which groups you do or don't identify with, if something is meant as a symbol of love according to God, let it be that. And if somebody is telling you that, follow the ideal of that symbol and don't turn it into something else. Okay, now that I have just lost us all of our subscribers, let me make a couple more observations about the rainbow that are slightly less politically charged. One thing is count the colors in a rainbow. There are 7. Go figure. The IVP Bible Background Commentary says the designation of the rainbow as a sign of the covenant does not suggest that this was the first rainbow ever seen. Catch that. A lot of Christians think this was the first rainbow. The Bible never says there was not a rainbow before this. God just says, I'm taking this rainbow and now it is functioning as a sign. A sign can be something that was there before and just now has new significance. And that's very likely what's going on here. Okay, back to IVP. The function of a sign is connected to the significance attached to it. In like manner, circumcision is designated as a sign of the covenant with Abraham. Yet that was an ancient practice, not new with Abraham and his family. In the Gilgamesh epic, the goddess Ishtar identified the lapis lazuli, deep blue semi-precious stones with traces of gold-colored pyrite, of her necklace as the basis of an oath by which she would never forget the days of the flood. An 11th century Assyrian relief shows 2 hands reaching out of the clouds, one hand offering a blessing, the other holding a bow. Since the word for rainbow is the same word as that used for the weapon, this is an interesting image. End quote. So just like so many features of this flood story are connected to or taken from other ancient flood myths, so is the idea of the rainbow, or at least some sort of a colored covenant that is made. Verse 18 picks up the genealogy from chapter 6. If you listen to our episode on chapter 6, I think it was like episode 12, something like that, I mentioned that the genealogy of Noah ends very abruptly, and it doesn't pick up again until here. So that whole in-between, it's like a little aside where we have stepped out of the genealogy that was being told. We told this story, and now we're stepping back into the genealogy from chapter 6. Verse 18 lists the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and it says specifically Ham is the father of Canaan, or we would say Canaan today. That's about to become important. There's a reason we are being told this. In fact, we're going to be told it again in just a second because Canaan is going to show up in the story that's about to happen. So let's keep looking here. Verse 19. These are the 3 sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. Noah began to be a husbandman. He planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and was drunk, and he was uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and he told his 2 brothers without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it on their shoulders, went backwards, covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were backward. They did not see their father's nakedness. Noah awoke from his wine, and he knew what his younger son had done to him. And he said, "Cursed be Canaan." Now catch that. Ham is the one who did wrong, but Canaan is the one that is being cursed here. "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants will he be to his brothers." And he said, as Noah said, "Blessed be Yahweh God of Shem, and Canaan will be his servant. God will enlarge Japheth, and he will dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan will be his servant." Noah lived after the flood 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Okay, that was a big section here, but it all goes together, so we have to read this together. Let's just take it from the top and go in order. Noah is said to be a man of the earth. Where it says a husbandman, that is literally a man of the land, which is very similar to the description that we were given of Cain, when it said that he was a man of the land who tilled the land and Abel was a keeper of the sheep. So now I think Noah is being set on par with Cain as someone who is actually doing a good thing. Because remember, Cain's being a husbandman, a worker of the ground, was a good thing. That is what God created the humans to be. They were to be humans of the land. Adam of the Adamah. They were supposed to be ruling and subduing over this. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. And we talk more in our episode on Genesis 4. Cain isn't the huge villain that we make him out to be, at least not for most of that story. Up until the time he kills Abel, he has not technically done anything wrong. So Noah's being a man of the land is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. That's what he was supposed to do. But the fact that it is very close to the description for Cain gets us thinking that something bad could be about to happen. I think it's also likely a contrast to his description in Genesis 6:9, where he was called a man of justice or of righteousness. So you have him as a man of justice / righteousness in chapter 6, verse 9. Now he is a man of the land. So you can see how this is a repeat of Eden. Like, the first thing this guy does is he goes and builds a garden. He is trying to create another Eden. But this time it is worse. He is going to fail in that garden again. And why? Because of fruit that he made, grapes. And the whole situation is worsened by his son. Children were humanity's shot at immortality after we lost our chance at immortality in the garden. We ourselves can no longer live forever, so from an ancient mindset, the more kids you have, the more that your name, your legacy gets to continue on. And it is that person who is supposed to carry on Noah's legacy that ends up committing such a heinous sin. Now let's talk about what exactly Ham did, because believe it or not, there is actually a lot of debate to this, and this can be a very confusing passage for the average person just reading it. There is a reason that most children's versions of the story stop at the end of the flood with the rainbow. It is very possible that you may never have even heard the rest of the story. You may never have known that Noah got drunk after the flood. You may never have known that whatever this is happened to him. So let's talk about it. Noah gets drunk, he passes out, he is unclothed in his tent. His younger son, Ham, sees the nakedness of his father and tells his two brothers. The two brothers take a garment, walking backwards, and cover the nakedness of their father so that they do not see their father's nakedness. That's a very awkward terminology, but there is a reason that it is put that way. I want to pause for a second here before I go any further and just give a little bit of a content warning that I am going to be talking in a second here about sexual violence and rape. So if that is triggering to you, you may want to skip ahead a little bit. I will put the time markers in the notes so you know which section to skip if you need to. A lot of modern day people looking at this would say, Ham saw his father naked. What's the big deal? Why is this something so important, so problematic that Noah had to utter this curse? What actually happened here? And some people, some commentators will suggest that nakedness was considered very different in the ancient Near East. Today, if you see a family member naked, it might be embarrassing, it might be awkward, but it's not the kind of thing where they're probably going to tell you that you and your descendants are going to be slaves for the rest of their days. That's not a very typical occurrence. And so people will say, if all he did was see his father naked, that could have even been an accident. Sure, it might have been a little awkward, but what's the big deal? And some commentators will try to say that it was just a bigger deal back then. And so this was an honor-shame culture. To see your elder, and especially your father, in that state was so shameful that it just required this kind of response. To me, that answer is unsatisfactory. For one, I think it overstates the significance of nakedness like that. Number two, it does not account for why Canaan was the one cursed. If Ham is the one who saw his father naked, and that was so wrong, he is the one who should have been punished for it, not his son. That makes no sense. However, if you pay careful attention to the specific language used in verses 21 to 23, I think we can answer what actually happened and why Canaan is the one who gets the brunt of the curse here. I'm going to read a passage out of Leviticus 18, and I want you to see if the language stands out as similar to you. The nakedness of your father or the nakedness of your mother you will not uncover, because she is your mother. You will not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of your father's wife you will not uncover. It is your father's nakedness. The nakedness of your sister, the daughter of your father, or the daughter of your mother, whether she be born at home or born abroad, even their nakedness shall you not uncover. It keeps going on for several more verses with other instances. But the one that I especially want you to pay attention to is verse 8. This is Leviticus 18:8. The nakedness of your father's wife you shall not uncover. It is your father's nakedness. You catch that? This is not saying don't go around pantsing people. It's not talking about just seeing them naked. This is a Hebrew euphemism for having sex with someone. To see the nakedness of someone is to have intercourse with them. And in an ancient Near Eastern mindset where there is a patriarchal culture and women are often second to men and unfortunately seen as the property of men, to uncover your mother's nakedness or to have sex with your mother, to have an incestuous relationship with your mother, is by their standards the same thing as having sex with your father, because your mother belongs to your father. That is why verse 8 says, don't uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. Now, in this case, it could also be a stepmother, because the verse before that talks specifically about your biological mother, but I think the implication is the same either way. Whoever your father's wife is, be they your mother or not, don't have sex with them, because it is the same thing as having sex with your father. Feeling uncomfortable yet? Let's look back at Genesis 9, and now we can understand why this was such a big deal. When it says that Ham saw the nakedness of his father, that is a euphemism for sex. So Ham violated his father. Now that does not explain why Canaan is the one cursed here. So I actually take this a step further. If we remember the language from the Leviticus passage of uncovering the nakedness of your father can also be incestuous sex with your mother, I think what is implied is that Ham saw his father drunk. He knew that his father was powerless to stop him, and he raped his own mother. This was an attempt by Ham to assert dominance over the family, essentially leading to his rule of the world, since they were the only humans on Earth at this time. The text says that he was Noah's younger son, so he would not have been next in line for family leadership. But sex can be a way to assert power. This happens in 2 Samuel 16 when Absalom has tried to take over the throne of Israel. And one of the first things that he does is demands to have David, his father's concubines or his sex slaves, marched out in front of him. And then he has sex with all of those women on the top of his palace in order for all Israel to see as a power play. I'm sorry to be crude here, but this property that used to belong to my father is now under my power. That is using sex as a weapon. And I think that is what Ham was trying to do here. If we're being honest, the same thing happens in war still today. So the reason I think that this makes more sense of the passage is because Canaan is never said to be born before this. He's mentioned a couple of times in verses 18 and 22, but it could very well be that that is just saying Ham was the father of Canaan, who would be born. Like, everyone would have known who Canaan was. And I think he was the illegitimate child of Ham and his mother. So then, if we look back at Noah's curse against Canaan, it says, "Cursed be Canaan." Now, the Hebrew is not as in your face as the English reads here. We tend to read this as a very authoritative statement that Canaan or Canaan should be cursed. Cursed be Canaan. But if you're using a translation that italicizes words that are included for readability, you'll notice that be is in italics. See, cursed is a passive participle in Hebrew. It's more like Canaan has been cursed or Canaan is now cursed. So we do not have to read this as Noah's saying, I am cursing Canaan because of what Ham did. It could very well just be his saying, Canaan, the child that has been born from this, is going to live a cursed life. There's only 8 humans in this region, 9 now with Canaan. They all know what happened. And can you imagine the ostracization that would happen there? The horrible ways that this Canaan would be treated and the shame that he would feel from an early childhood because of what his father did. So this could very well be Noah's describing the situation instead of prescribing the situation. He might not be saying that Canaan should be cursed, but that he is just going to have a cursed existence because of this. He is going to be rejected by humans. And this very much fits parallel with the narrative of Cain. Because just like Cain was the first human cursed, now in this new earth, we already have another human cursed. Now, Cain's name in Hebrew is Cain. Canaan's name in Hebrew is Canaan. They are spelled a little bit differently. It's kind of like how in English we have C and we have K, and they can both make the hard C sound. They both can go k, whether it's the C or the K. It's kind of that same way in Hebrew. They have 2 hard C letters as well. And so Cain's name and Canaan's name are spelled differently, but you can very easily hear the connection between Cain and Canaan. They do still sound close enough that I think they are meant to be set in parallel with each other. I also think it is really important that we note this curse did not come from God. This is Noah speaking. Nowhere in the text is any indication given that God authorized Noah to state this or that he backed Noah's decision in saying this. It was very common in the ancient Near East for the patriarch of the family to be able to give a blessing or an anti-blessing to his children at the end of his life. So just because this happened, it does not mean that God approved of it. So this may very well have been out of line for Noah to say as well. We do not know. I'm just giving you a few different ways that you can read this. Some people even take the view that maybe Noah couldn't curse Ham directly because back at the start of the chapter, I told you to remember this for later, here's where it comes in, God blessed not just Noah, but his sons. So some people think that since Noah and his sons, including Ham, were blessed by God, Noah couldn't offer a curse on someone who was already blessed by God. That's also a possibility. The IVP commentary goes into that a little bit, so I'll put that quote in the notes, and they try to suggest that maybe the reason that Canaan instead of Ham was cursed is because Canaan was part of it. Maybe he was in on something else and Noah had been meaning to offer this curse for a while, and this just gave him the reason to. All of that just ends up being conjecture. I think that the best and most faithful reading of this is to suggest that as awkward and awful as it is, that Ham used incestuous sex with his mother as a power grab in order to rule over the earth of this time. And that would be absolutely consistent because sexual violence forms an inclusio around the flood story. The flood came partially as a result of the sexual violence of the sons of God against human women, and now, as the story has ended, we have sexual violence happening again. I also want to point out that Shem and Japheth are depicted doing the same thing that God did in the garden, covering nakedness. Ham took advantage of a moment of vulnerability like the serpent did, but Shem and Japheth cover the nakedness. And unlike Adam, Noah didn't recognize that he was naked. So there's all these different hyperlinks going back to the garden story between the nakedness and the covering and the fruit, just so much going on there. There is one other option in reading this that I just want to throw out here, and it is that some people think that this story was a later inclusion by the editors of Scripture during the time of the exile in order to explain their rivalries. See, as the story goes on and Israel becomes a people and they enter the land, the majority of their enemies are descendants of Canaan. They are in the land of Canaan, Canaan, and they have the Canaanites, as the majority of their enemies through the rest of the story. It's honestly almost juvenilely amusing how much Genesis portrays Israel's enemies as the descendants of inbreeding. It's like one massive yo mama joke, or like making West Virginia or Alabama jokes here in the United States. Genesis serves as the place setting for the rest of the Tanakh, the rest of the Old Testament, the rest of Israel's story. And so it's explaining where all of these major players come from. And their enemies are mostly Canaanites, descendants of Canaan. So they want to portray them in a bad light. How do you do that? You just say, your ancestor was the result of an incestuous relationship. How's that make you feel? And if this was a one-off thing, we might just say, that's a little weird. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. But the thing is that it's not a one-off. It happens again later on in Genesis when Israel's other enemies, the Moabites and the Ammonites, are depicted as the result of an incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters. So it really just feels like a middle school locker room of insulting each other's parents, basically. Like these later editors were a little juvenile in trying to stick it to their enemies by saying that they were the result of inbreeding. That's definitely not the version you heard in Sunday school, but it is there in the Bible. Let's wrap this up with the last couple verses here. Just as Canaan is cursed, Shem and Japheth are blessed. Shem's blessing should be no surprise to us, since the writers of this story are Shemites, or we would say Semites, Israelites, Jewish. They would see Shem as the hero of the story. So, of course, he is the one who is blessed in this. And Japheth gets in on it as well. Noah says, God will enlarge Japheth, and he will dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan will be his servant. Now, that dwelling in the tents of Shem, that could be either positive or negative. It could be saying that he is somewhat subservient to Shem, or it could be saying that he is going to be in league with Shem and able to sit in peace with him. Either way, both are being presented as blessed in place of Ham, who is missing here. I will point out as well that there is an emphasis on these three brothers together, just like you have three brothers in Genesis 4 of Abel, Cain, and Seth. There's also a little bit of a play on words going with Japheth's name. In Hebrew, his name is read Yefet, and the word for enlarge is Yaphat. So Yefet was Yaphat. God would enlarge Japheth. And it's likely that his name comes from the same root, suggesting that his blessing extends for many generations. And this is a whole other conversation for another day. But I believe that the Apostle Paul really took a hold of that, because if you trace his missionary journeys, it is almost entirely in the region of where Japheth's descendants went. And so Paul, who was Semitic, a Shemite, was trying to reach the descendants of Japheth with what he saw as the good news of this Messiah, trying to let the descendants of Japheth dwell in the tents of Shem, if you will. A Shemite sharing good news with Japhethites. Really, really interesting study. Before we finish, I have to take a second and acknowledge that this passage of Scripture has been used to abuse other humans worse than nearly any other passage. This is pretty high up there on the list of passages that have gotten misused throughout history. And here's why. If you trace out where the descendants of these three sons of Noah went, you end up with the descendants of Shem mostly going into the Middle Eastern area, the descendants of Japheth mostly going north into Europe area, and then the descendants of Ham going more south into Africa. So people have looked at the curse on Canaan as a racial thing, that people from regions of Africa are under this curse, and that they are therefore less human than people from, say, the line of Shem or the line of Japheth. And usually it's people from the line of Japheth who are using this to abuse other humans. Thankfully, this has mostly fallen out of favor. If you look at even the most basic of commentaries, they're probably going to tell you that the curse on Canaan has nothing to do with race or ethnicity. It has nothing to do with black people being under some curse from God. But it was a prominent view for a while. And this is why I think resources like this podcast are so important. Because when you lived in that time, it made sense to take the end of Genesis 9 as a proof text for the belief that blacks were less human because they were under God's curse. Now we look at that and go, that is awful. What idiot would ever think of that? But at the time, that was a prevailing view, and this was a proof text that was used. Now, to the extent that different people believed it, that you can argue over. But we can't argue over the fact that it was actually used to abuse and enslave humans. So we have to be very careful, because we might think, oh, I would have totally never believed that. I never would have used this verse out of context that way. Well, if you lived in that time, yeah, you probably would have. And probably I would have too. Because we are products of our culture and the way that we hear the Bible interpreted. So if we are going to be hard on those people back then, we need to be harder on ourselves, because we actually have the resources now to understand what these passages meant in the ancient world. So be very careful that you don't think too highly of yourself and the interpretations you have of Scripture. Just because something is taken for granted as a biblical view does not actually mean that it truly is biblical. Here's a thought experiment for you. A couple hundred years down the line from now, what might our descendants be shocked at that we use the Bible to justify? Because I guarantee you there will be some things that they understand. That's not the way the Bible was meant to be read, but we just take it for granted today. So let's be humble in the ways that we interpret Scripture and realize that a lot of times we are more influenced by our culture than we think we are. And there's a difference between what the Bible teaches and what I think it teaches. Anything that takes the Bible and makes it racist or unloving toward other humans is not what God intended. We have made it now to the end of Noah's life, and what a life it has been. And what a complex chapter this has been. We covered quite a bit of ground here today, and I am sure that some questions will come up from this. So if you have any, be sure to send them in. Remember, you can do that on our socials. You can do that on our website. You can also do it via email, cconn, cconn, @thebibleuncut.com. Next week, we're going to pick up chapter 10, and chapter 10 is one of those chapters that kind of gets glossed over when most people are reading the story, because there are a lot of really hard to pronounce names. And a lot of the details in there seem unnecessary to the average modern reader on first glance. But we are all about taking more than just the first glance here in this podcast. And if you've listened to our episodes on chapter 4 and chapter 5 of Genesis, you know that there is actually a lot that can come from those genealogy passages. A lot that we don't always realize the first time. So we're going to dig deep into that and pull out some really, really fascinating material. We're going to talk about the origins of the nations, the people groups, and what exactly that means. And possibly one of my favorite discussions that we'll have in this entire series, we're going to talk about how Looney Tunes changed the public perception of a Bible character. Seriously, you're going to have to tune in next week to hear that. Until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.